Recommended by Who Do You Think You Are magazine and featured on BBC Radio.
Building an audio library for the genealogists with too much time on their hands. Here's your presenter, Malcolm Noble.
Hello everyone, thank you for being there. It always makes a difference, you know. And welcome along to episode 28 of the Talk Genealogy podcast.
The podcast for the genealogists with too much time on their hands.
How's your family history work going? I hope you're not taking too many evenings off. If you are, well, you're in luck, because tonight you have found the podcast for the genealogists with too much time on their hands. Each month we look at a different source for research, or the life of a genealogist from the olden days, or perhaps a different technique or way of doing things. You'll find a list of the subjects that we've covered in old podcasts on the website talkgenealogy.blog. We're up to number 28 this evening, but before we go any further, I want to remind you, as always, that I'm neither a professional nor an expert. I'm an enthusiast like you who has spent more years than he should have done digging up his family tree, often in the wrong place. And these podcasts are really no more than me sharing with you some of the lessons that I've learned along the way. And as always, I want to emphasise that I am talking about ancestor hunting in England.
Building an audio library with Malcolm Noble.
Now tonight, if you'll allow me, I want to look at how we can use the information which we have already gathered to add a little more substance to those old forebears that we've tracked down. I look at it this way. We found the different families and placed them in their homes. We know about mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, brothers, sisters, husbands and wives, but we don't really know too much about them. Well, let's start out on the road to changing that. I say that we're creeping up to a window and taking a look. We've got to duck down quickly because they're likely to spot us, but that quick glimpse is enough for us to put some flesh on those notions of our ancestors. And I want you to take some reassurance that I wouldn't be offering this talk tonight unless I had experienced the benefits of the technique. I know from my own family history work that this does pay good dividends. But to get it right, we do need to stick to some rules, otherwise the process will lead us to rubbish that's good for neither use nor ornament. We'll go through those rules in some detail in a moment. But first, doing it properly means that we're taking on a fair chunk of work. Let's settle that from the start. It is labour intensive, but once you've used the model for a first time, it does get easier when you employ it again. I'd say that you need to put aside a few months of your hobby time to do this properly. You'll soon find out if it's a method that suits you or not. Tonight's subject can be a little dry and stodgy. Now, I wonder how many times I've muttered that warning. So I want to build the model by using examples rather than dictating a textbook. We'll start with one entry in an election poll book from Old England. Now, we spoke about these in episode 14 if you want to check back. That one entry will tell us something about our relative standing in the community. And it also says something, of course, about those ancestors who are not included. The one with the franchise held sufficient land to be included, but it is just one slither of evidence, and not really enough for you to build a character study around it. So, if it is the standing in the community that we're addressing, link that up with, say, 7, 8, perhaps 10 different indicators. The amount he left to the church and the poor in his will. Whether he left more to the church than the poor. Time spent on any parochial office, such as church wardens. How others referred to him. It won't take you long, and the more indicators you include, the more credit you're going to be adding to your account. The next step from establishing the indicators is to draw 2 or 3 questions from each indicator that you need to ask your dead ancestor. For example, did you leave more than 20 shillings per year to the poor of the parish? Do any parish records refer to you as a yeoman? And so on. Now, the wording of those questions is very important, and we'll go on about it later in this podcast. But first, I want to give you some idea, some sort of overview of the process. Having asked perhaps 20 questions, focused on 7 or more indicators, we are already in a much stronger position to make a statement about our ancestor. But we're still 2 steps away, at least, from securing the foundation of any argument. We need to ask exactly the same questions of other people in a broader population with a common factor. The common factor is easy, they're all part of the family. But why do we need to go for that broader group? Now, the larger the population is that you choose, the more useful the technique will be. Again, let's build the thing by looking at an example. I had a notion, a feeling, that generations who had lived in the same village for more than a century were a closely knit family. So I devised some questions from such indicators as intermarriage, living and working together, the naming of children, and supporting signatures on wedding licenses, wedding registers and wills. I therefore chose to ask the same questions of every person on my family tree who had appeared in a parish record over a 250-year period. In another example, looking at a different subject, I addressed some questions to names on the family tree over a 120-year period, but extended the population to cover 2 parishes, the next door neighbours. We call this our population, and we need to define it carefully. Notice that I've said appeared in the parish records, quite specific. And having recognised the boundaries of our population, it is important that we don't allow intruders in just because they come with a good chunk of data. That will skew the results. Talkgenealogy.blog. Here is the website that supports the monthly podcast for the genealogists with too much time on their hands. You'll find links to previous episodes, a full list of books mentioned in the series, 1 or 2 details about other genealogy work I've done, and every now and then, though more then than now, a bit of a blog.
Building an audio library for the genealogists with too much time on their hands.
Now, I said that I chose every person in my family tree who appeared in the parish record over a 250-year period to be my subject. Why so encompassing? Surely I could look at my direct ancestor and their children without extending the research to cousins and wives. Well, if you want our answers to be robust as well as interesting, you want at least 100 respondents, if you can call a dead ancestor a respondent. Also, applying the questionnaire across the family tree, make sure that you research those collateral lines thoroughly. Believe me, it's good for the soul. Listen, do you hear that? That is the statisticians telling us that before we can make proper use of the exercise, we need to compare the results from our family tree with a more general population. Of course, this is an option. It will be a very large project if we include the whole village as a comparator, larger still if we go for the diocese, and I wouldn't want to discourage anybody from embarking on such a mammoth task. The more mammoth the task, the more mammoth the value, perhaps. But genealogists have a built-in advantage here. Yes, it is important to compare our results against some sort of standard. But why not a different branch of our family tree? Regular listeners will have picked up that I researched the pedigree of my 4 grandparents. That is, my family origins in Nottinghamshire, Suffolk and Cambridgeshire, Lincolnshire and London. And believe me, I'm no expert on London records. I've always found it interesting to compare the lives of my East Anglian branch with the East Midlands branch. On the face of it, their lives should have been very similar. Rural, agricultural, then moving to a market town in a region with a textile-based economy. But hey, they were entirely different, and it is comparisons, like tonight's example, that reveal those differences. Oh, by the way, it's not so illuminating to compare, say, the 17th century with the 19th century, because the differences are likely to be much as you would expect. The two populations are simply too different to compare usefully. Well, that's what I think. Now, already you might be thinking that we could apply this technique not only to the objective elements of biography, but also to the more personal issues of character. We can build up evidence to look at our ancestors' religious thinking, for example. Okay, perhaps we know that they were Protestant, but does that mean conformist, Puritan, or even separatist? And were they royalist or parliamentarian? I have one colleague who has used this technique to work on what sort of food her family was most likely to be eating in the 17th century. It is this aspect that I find most exciting. It introduces a new dimension to our understanding of the family's past. We can approach these subjects because we look at one strand of evidence, we strengthen it with other indicators, then we reinforce it by seeking evidence across the family spectrum, and finally testing it with the comparative population.
Here's some earlier episodes of the podcast. Episode 15. Let's talk of graves, of worms, of epitaphs. Episode 13 was about the hearth tax. Episode 12, and it was Shakespeare, for example. Episode 9 discussed the medieval pipe rolls. Go to episode 7 for the companions of William the Conqueror. Episode 2, The Herald's Visitations, and our very first episode looked at working with Judah Wills. Building an audio library for the genealogists with too much time on their hands.
For this month's retrospective, we're going back 2 years so that we could listen to an extract from episode 9 on the medieval pipe rolls, another hobby horse of mine. That number's still available, so let's just do a bit of eavesdropping, see what was going on. You know, I can bore for England when it comes to the pipe rolls. I think everything about them is just inspiring. And I know I do tend to go on a bit when I've got them in my head. Now, this is the clever part. The table is divided into columns for pence, shillings, pounds, scores of pounds, hundreds of pounds, thousands, and tens of thousands, with an empty column at each end. The official places on one side the taxes which are due. Twopence for this, 2 score for that, a bob here, and so on. And the accepted receipts or allowances in the columns at the other side of the table. Because they are set out in recognised patterns, you can tell any difference without counting or totalling them. Think of the patterns on domino. As I say, that episode on the pipe rolls is still available if you go to the website talkgenealogy.blog. Now then, let's get on with tonight's episode. Now let's talk about the design of the questions. I wanted to know, in my example, if the family was close-knit. So I came up with 7 indicators for that, as I've mentioned, for example, intermarriage. And I drew a yes-no question from that topic. did you marry someone you were already related to? The answer is yes or no, although it may be easier to analyse later on if you record the answer as either 1 or 0. Now this does prompt further questions. Who did you marry and how close were they? These are not yes-no questions, and so we realise that we're going to need 2 different types of questionnaire, or at least 2 databases on which to record the results. One with quantitative answers, the other with qualitative answers. Very often the qualitative answers come from supplementary or explanatory questions. Now, incidentally, and this shows how important it is to get the questions right, I tried several definitions of how close a relationship could be before I counted it as some sort of intermarriage. Now, I found for my purposes, the definition was that it was close enough for me, Malcolm Noble, to believe that you would have known about the existing relationship. Now, no statistician or sociologist would allow such a prejudicial question. It may be nonsense scientifically, but it fitted the criteria that I was looking for, and hey, I was in charge. Use the quantitative answers to make your point, which you can then qualify, explain or elaborate on with the qualitative questions. And when you come to count up and analyse the results, you might find it useful to match any trends to the more general lifetime information. This enabled me to show, for example, that while the family had become very tightly knit over a relatively brief period, shorter than 2 generations, and I counted this across a number of indicators, remember, this was fractured by the migration from rural to town communities. Branches that had been a closely knit network quickly became almost disassociated from each other. For simplicity, I have addressed only one question here, intermarriage, but I did work on 7 indicators of a close-knit family network, and I worked out as much as 17 questions. Some indicators merited only one simple question, others went further. So asking 17 questions over 200 dead ancestors was quite an undertaking, especially since many of the answers from the individuals had to be researched before we could find them. And that was another spin-off. My research felt more complete, a lot more thoroughly done after I had finished. Of course, I then repeated the exercise with the other branch of the family tree for comparison, but let's be honest, I did rather skimp on that side of things. Having completed one research exercise, you will be aware of how valuable a database of information you have collated. Imagine what a treasure house you would have if you continued to add other questions. Over a relatively short number of years, you will be able to analyse your data in different ways to suit different questions. In this way, your own work will become a valuable resource. It just takes a little imagination. Now, I've recently published the latest book on my family history. This one is called Plague in Bleasby. A Nottinghamshire village survives its summer of death. Being concerned with an outbreak of bubonic plague in 1604, the study is, of course, more of a segment of parish history than a strict family saga. In a village of 300 souls, the plague carried off 1/3, 100. So the questionnaire approach, by the way, that's what people call this thing that we're doing tonight. This questionnaire approach to research was a valuable way of understanding what was going on in the village. At one stage, I looked for evidence of close ties with other parish registers. I asked each parish if they had direct walking links with one another, and found myself walking and photographing an ancient trackway that connected them 400 years ago, but in some places is impassable now. Was this the plague road, I wonder, the route through which the bubonic plague had been transmitted 400 years ago? I asked each parish what percentage of marriages had the same surname as a plague victim in my parish? The answer wasn't significant, but it did reveal the marriage of the first plague victims. Important stuff. I asked each victim if they had been born in the previous 5 years, if their family wills indicated that they were yeomen, husbandmen or tradesmen. I asked about their family role, the status of their family, and what part of the village they lived in. Now, the important element in the questionnaire approach is not so much the answers, but it's the measurement of how significant those answers are within a wider population. That point is really the crux of it. Now, regular listeners will have picked up that being an old-fashioned genealogist, I'm more comfortable working with card indexes than databases. And the card index which I've built up just by asking questions of the plague victims and the parishioners surprised even me. It's a little gold mine. It really shows the value of the questionnaire approach. There may be some common threads in tonight's episode and episode 18 on prosopography, but here we will be tailoring things much more to suit the family historian. At this stage, I want to recommend a paper by Verboten, Carlier and Dumoulin, a short manual of prosopography. Although I had used questionnaire surveys before I read this paper, it certainly tidied up the way that I do it. Not only did it tidy up my practice, but it also tidied my understanding of what I was doing and why I was doing it. So I would like to spend no more than a couple of minutes just picking out a couple of points from their paper. Now, I've no intention of becoming too serious and certainly not studious, but I just want to keep us on track. Verboten and the others say that the differences in successful research methodology can be found when the research subject is based on an individual, biography, a lineage or family, genealogy, a specific group or category, prosopography, or society or part of society, what they call sociography. They point out that the focus on the individual reduces as we move along that scale. Biography, genealogy, prosopography, sociography. Obviously, a biography is very much concerned with the individual, and then it reduces as you move along the scale. Now, they do define the family more tightly than I would find acceptable. I don't think that they would include cousins in their definitions. So we can see that the work I'm setting out this evening leans a little more towards prosopography, and we need to take account of the opportunities but also the pitfalls of that discipline. Here are some of the pitfalls. Define your population and don't allow intruders in just because they have useful data. Be sure that your population has at least one thing in common, one common factor. Know the boundaries in terms of geography, time and category. Take some time formulating your quantitative answers so there is no hesitation between yes and no. Allow no space for maybes or allow no space for maybes, sometimes or sort of. You cannot change the question halfway through. If you do, you need to go back from the beginning and you'll never finish this game of snakes and ladders. Always note your sources, not because it's good professional practice, but believe me, you will want to go back and check on them. Finding your questions will be easier if you formulate a hypothesis beforehand, a notion that your research can either prove or disprove. And lastly, don't think there's not a lot of labour involved, because you'll find that there is. Now, those pitfalls are the reason why I have dithered for a couple of minutes setting out the back. Now, just to recap, we are looking to find out more about our ancestors by coming up with a list of questions that we're going to ask across a broad population. And to make our conclusion interesting, we're going to compare the results with the results from a different branch of our genealogy. Now, as is often the case, I want to emphasise that this is not a 5-minute job. As I've said, you need to put aside a few months of your family history time to complete the exercise. But as we are so often stating, this is the podcast for the genealogists with too much time on their hands. Now, when you come to analyse your results, of course, it pays to be systematic, but don't let that fence you in. Experiment of different ways of presenting the data in a timeline, or showing yes and no answers, or showing how the yes answers built up in 5 or 10 year chunks. Look for national events, especially religious reform or tax revisions, and see how the picture before differs from the picture afterwards. Let a pie chart indicate how the role within the family influenced the answers. By experimenting this way, you will find the clearest and perhaps the most dramatic way of showing your results. When it comes to analysing the qualitative answers, okay, you may want to group them by the incidence of keywords if you like, but don't lose their value as free text. Hey, I'm sorry if tonight's talk has been rather heavy going. I'm sure that it has been, so congratulations on getting to the end of episode 28 of the Talk Genealogy podcast. I hope you'll have a go at the questionnaire approach and that you'll find it as useful as I've done. Believe me, I wish I'd found it years ago. I want to thank Emily Brooks and Stephanie for the voiceovers and Freeze Effects for the music. I will be posting another episode of the Talk Genealogy podcast on the 3rd of October. I hope that I can count on you being there. Until then, I want to wish you good night and a God bless.
MalcolmNoble.com.
Any questions or comments? Any ideas or suggestions? You can contact the podcast through the website talkgenealogy.blog or through the Facebook page, and there's Twitter, of course. On social media, just search for Talk Genealogy.
Here's your presenter, Malcolm Noble.
Hello everyone, I'm taking time out just to record a very short series of brief podcasts to support the release of my history about the plague in a Nottinghamshire village in 1604. Okay, these podcasts are going to be about 10 minutes each. I'll post them each Tuesday night and we'll leave them up for, a couple of months, no more than that. Now, rather than tell the story of the plague from A to B, hey, that's in the book, I'm going to explore the background in a bit more detail and perhaps tag a particular thread to look at. Tonight we're going to look at the Battle of East Stoke, sometimes called the Battle of Stoke Field. In 1604, the Trentside village of Bleasby in Nottinghamshire was hit by the bubonic plague. It took off 100, give or take a soul or two, from a population that was, best guess, a touch over 300. The plague in Bleasby, a Nottinghamshire village, survives its summer of death. You'll find out more about it at plagueinbleasby.com. I've written myself a book. I guess the keywords would be cricket, that's simple enough, Bingham, which is a town near Nottingham in England, and horseball, so taken together quite a narrow audience, which is why I've only printed a few copies. It's the history of 4 brothers who built the town's cricket team in the early 1800s. Their grandfather was my great times 7 grandfather, so there's a touch of family history as we look at the tribulations of their farming furrows and their cricketing characters in Regency England. The Horseballs, 4 brothers and cricket in Bingham. Ask wherever you buy your books, Check it out through your local library or contact me through my website malcolmnoble.com. I'll tell you what, to make it easy, I'll make sure there's always a buy now on eBay. You know, so many cricketing histories treat these early games as curiosity of prehistory, and that really needs